All right. So just briefly what this introduction will cover is today's purpose. I'm going to jump very briefly into the sustainability framework just to talk about both the environmental benefits behind what we're doing, but why this is important for social benefits and economic benefits. And then I will dive into what those different benefits are in relation to electric vehicles and clean energy, and then briefly touch on electric vehicles, range and cost, and how that is improving over the long term, and why electric vehicles are a good economic solution. And so to begin, of course, our objectives today are for everyone to better understand the electric vehicles and clean energy policy issues as a whole. And then we're going to touch on increasing familiarity with upcoming electric vehicle and clean energy legislation that we will expect to come up in this coming legislative session. And then for people to improve their skill set in tracking and advocating for this upcoming legislation, interacting with policymakers, and so forth. And so discussing sustainability or looking at a framework of people, planet, and profit, it's really important, I believe, when we're discussing clean energy and electric vehicles, to talk about both the environmental benefits, of course, reducing carbon emissions, addressing climate change, but also to really connect these issues with social benefits and what we'll discuss, health benefits, and then the economic benefits such as providing more money for people's pocketbooks. As we learned in this past election, pocketbook issues are important, and the more that we can connect these to some of our environmental causes, the more success that we will have going forward. And so really quick, touching on the carbon budget, back in 2011, the Unburnable Carbon Initiative found that we can only emit 886 gigatons of carbon dioxide between the year 2000 and 2050. And as of 2011, we had already consumed 1/3 of that carbon budget, meaning that going forward, we have to significantly cut our carbon emissions. Of course, more climate reports have come out recently suggesting that we have to move even faster than before. And moreover, looking at our sources of fossil fuels, about 80% of those have to stay in the ground, 80% of the ones that we know about. There are plenty out there that we do not know about, meaning that we have to accelerate faster and faster away from fossil fuels and towards more renewable resources. Of course, transportation is a big part of fossil fuel consumption. And so switching to electric vehicles to power our transportation moving forward is incredibly important. And jumping on this need to reduce our fossil fuel consumption, we have this C40 Cities Pledge, which I bring up because Seattle is actually one of the cities that has signed this pledge, meaning that these cities commit to having zero emissions from their transportation sector by 2030. And if we have a city like Seattle signing that pledge and wanting to move forward, then that opens the door for us to enact certain policies around clean transportation, where we will have a city like Seattle helping to lead the way. But of course, we have to give more policy and market signals from a state level as well. And of course, Washington State and Seattle get a large amount of their electricity from hydropower, which then makes our transition to electric vehicles much more, or reduces our carbon emissions from that much faster relative to other areas that are still using fossil fuels. We have Los Angeles up there as well. Yeah. Yeah, so there are plenty more cities up here. Initially, yeah, I wasn't able to include all of them on here. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they want to, significantly reduce by 2030. It's, 2018, almost 2019. And then jumping into, of course, one of the social benefits, the health risks of gasoline and diesel. An MIT study had found that around 55,000 Americans die annually from gasoline and diesel exhaust exposure, which is, if you look, it's about 18,000 more than the amount of people who died in 2016 due to traffic accidents, which means you are much more likely to die from the from exhaust than you are from the actual accidents. which is incredibly important because in Washington State, the Department of Ecology found that about half the population sits in high risk zones, meaning that if we are able to reduce our fossil fuel consumption and then the diesel exhaust emissions that many of us experience, we ourselves in Washington State can reduce that number of us who die from diesel exhaust exposure significantly. And of course, I've put more information in these slides than we have time for, so I'm going to be moving a little bit quickly through some of these denser slides, as you can see. But point being, exhaust affects a lot of our body in a lot of different areas. And then this figure shows that it impacts you throughout your entire life. This is a map showing from pregnancy all the way to end of life that diesel exhaust exposure can significantly impact your health. And then moving to energy and economic security, there is the Securing America's Future Energy, which is a think tank that really discusses the movement away from gasoline and diesel exposure from more of an economic and national security perspective. Of course, switching to locally generated electricity means that we don't have, our economy is less reliant on oil and gas that is coming from a lot of other areas in the country. We can generate local jobs through the use of electricity for transportation. And so switching over to electric vehicles allows for us to strengthen our own local economy, then sending some of that money across to other nations. And this figure here shows more so that as EV adoption increases around the world, there's going to be less and less oil that's actually going to be consumed. And with that excess, that can, if we in Washington State and America don't switch over to electric vehicles, we may be more proportionately reliant on these markets relative to where we are now, which as more oil shocks can continue, that can impact our own economy much more severely than it has in the past. And so with electric vehicles, Bloomberg New Energy Finance estimates that by 2040, 55% of car sales will be electric and 33% of the global fleet will be electric. And as that previous slide had pointed, if we aren't moving along with it, then we will become more susceptible and more reliant on the global fossil fuel market as a whole. But we know that consumers are still concerned about range and costs. And so this slide is to show that as time goes on, more cars with farther range will become available. And this figure shows that as time goes on, as the technology is getting better, electric vehicle costs will decline due to improving battery technology. And already electric vehicles boast 1/4 of the fuel costs and 1/2 of the maintenance cost. So the sticker price or that upfront capital cost is going to decrease over time across all vehicle sizes. And this figure, which I'm going to skip over and move on to the next part of our program, just shows that decreasing cost across all different types of vehicles. And so at this point, I would like to introduce Vlad, who will be discussing clean energy and electric vehicle policy in this upcoming legislative session.
Oh, cool. Handy. Hello, everybody. I'm Vlad Gutman Britton. I'm the Washington Director of Climate Solutions. Folks on the phone, am I like in the shot? Where do I need to stand? Am I right? This way? Maybe I should stand over there. I appreciate everyone coming out today. One second. All right. Okay, so I want to go through the climate agenda as Climate Solutions, a season, Audubon, a lot of our partners are working on sort of a unified approach to a set of policies and agenda items for this session to rapidly address our emissions throughout multiple sectors. So I'm gonna start this rather than before I jump right into the policy. I'm gonna talk about a little bit of what the emissions picture is in Washington. So these first couple of slides are from a Washington State report called the Deep Decarbonization Report. It was seeking to figure out how the state reduces emissions to 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. There's plenty of reason to think that this is an insufficient goal, especially with recent IPCC reports and things like that, but it is sort of a statewide pathway that shows fairly, shows what a pathway might be for the state of Washington. And I usually like to start with this because it puts into perspective for me, and I think for others, the scale of the transition we're talking about. And again, there's plenty of reason to think that this is not enough and we need to go further. So take this as sort of a conservative estimate of what we need to get done. So that bar on the left, on the right rather, is the 1990 bar. That blue bar is 88.4 million tons of emissions. The last available emissions inventory for the state, we're about 7% over that 1990 level. And if we're going to reduce by 80% by 2050, we need to get to that gray bar all the way on the right, about an 82% reduction from 2013. This is CO2 equivalent, yeah. And so again, very likely, a lot of studies actually show we need to be net neutral by 2050, and so this is just one pathway pointed to 80%, and just to kind of talk about what it means. So this blue bar down here, this blue line across the bottom, that's where we need to be from energy-related emissions. We're about at 80 million tons in 2016. If we don't do anything in the current policy environment, we'll reduce about 20 million tons, which is not nothing, but we fall short by about 50 million tons. We need an extra 50 million tons from what the economy will naturally yield right now. That's 50% reductions associated with electricity. It's closing coal, replacing it with natural gas and some renewables, more efficient gasoline engines and some electrification, some EV deployment, things like that, more efficient diesel engines, and we actually have an increase in the use of natural gas. All nice reductions, but woefully, dramatically, extremely far short of what we need to be doing, even for this relatively conservative goal. Oops, this is what it looks like to get the job done. So, or the job being, again, 80% reductions. We largely eliminate all of our emissions associated with electricity. All single occupancy vehicles must be electric by 2050, probably much sooner. Many medium and heavy duty vehicles have to be electrified. Some remaining uses of liquid fuels would have to be replaced with biofuels. And we have to deeply reduce our use of natural gas for heating and for water and space heating. The point of this is that we have to have very significant reductions across the board, across all sectors, and we need to be starting yesterday reasonably. But this is basically what it looks like. What's interesting about this pathway is that the state found that if we achieve this reduction, this reduction pathway, the average household will spend between $7 and $90 less on energy than we do today. So even though this is a significant transition with a lot of job opportunities in the state of Washington, significant investment, we end up spending less money on it. That's a positive thing. So where before we could talk about the need to transition for climate and environmental reasons, now there's a pocketbook argument as well, and that's very positive. So what are the kind of sets of options and sets of policies that Climate Solutions, Audubon, and other folks, Washington Environmental Council, and things like that are pursuing? So one of the policies is 100% clean electricity mix, is transitioning Washington off of using fossil fuels for electricity. So I know this is an EV gathering, but I'm starting with where we get electricity. I have an EV, and I plug it in Seattle. Many of you guys probably do too. Does anyone have a guess as to what the main source of electricity is when you plug your EV in at home in Seattle? It's natural gas. No matter where you are, the marginal resource in the West is natural gas. The thing that the utilities turn on to get that extra kilowatt hour of energy they put in your car is in the West is generally natural gas. So we have a pretty clean electricity grid. About 70+% is coming from non-carbon resources, but that doesn't mean that the job is done. Now we have to worry about transportation. When we purchase EVs, when we drive EVs, when Seattle City, or rather King County Metro purchase electric buses, they are charging their buses with natural gas generated, fossil fuel generated electricity. And that's why a clean electricity policy should be very important to folks that care about primarily EVs and transportation too. The marginal resource in the Northwest is gas. No matter how much hydro we have, it's largely spoken for. Extra load served with fossil fuels. So I just wanted to kind of start, why am I talking about electricity first? This is from that same state study, what it looks like to get, according to them, to 80% below what the electricity's role is. So folks talk about why 100%, can we do a little bit less? Maybe not folks in this room, but legislators and utilities. Why are we so fixated on 100%? Is it just a bumper sticker? And what they found is in order to get 80% reductions in the entire economy, 98% of electricity by 2050 has to come from non-fossil sources. So 80% reductions economy-wide, the electricity sector has to go much further, which is why clean electricity policy we think is the foundation, the bedrock upon which we can build the rest of the decarbonization of the economy from transportation, industrial uses, heating, and things like that. And this is really consistent across many studies. This is a White House study, last White House. National Grid, the reason that I like to call them out, National Grid, has anyone heard of National Grid? National Grid is a large utility, just like Puget Sound, much larger actually than Puget Sound Energy, that serves electricity in the Northeast. It's about 50–60% fossil fuels right now. It also provides electricity in the United Kingdom, very large company. So this is not an environmental group. This is a big fossil fuel heavy utility that found that in order for their geographies to reach 80% below, we have to fully decarbonize electricity as well. And that's, again, coming from a utility, I think that's fairly interesting and compelling. And this is from a study that Climate Solutions commissioned to figure out how does the Northwest decarbonize our electricity and what might it cost. And this was one of the scenarios we found the cheapest one from the particular model we use. And we found significant investments in wind and solar, 15,000 megawatts of new solar, about 12,000 megawatts of new wind. And the total cost is less than half a cent a kilowatt hour in 2050. And that's with a very conservative model. So all of this is to show that, there's a very affordable and technically feasible path to fully ending the use of fossil fuels in the electricity sector. And this is just, again, one of the pathways that we identified to do that. Oh, and then, well, I'll skip this one since I think time is short. So the other kind of major policy that is more directly in the wheelhouse of the things we're talking about today is the Clean Fuels program. Clean Fuels is a low carbon fuel standard is a policy that exists in California, it exists in Oregon, it exists in British Columbia. The only state on the Western seaboard that doesn't have one is Washington State. It also exists in the United Kingdom and the EU. And so what the Clean Fuels program does is it requires a reduction in the carbon intensity of transportation fuels. Fuels below the line generate credits, fuels above the line generate deficits. What that means for electricity is that it's a significant credit generator, and the purchasers of those credits are oil refineries. So the reason we like this program is it's directly targeted at carbon intensity. It's designed to choose the least cost pathway to achieve it, and it's paid for entirely by oil refiners and fossil fuel importers. So because they generate deficits, their product, their gasoline, their diesel is really dirty, they're required to buy these credits from folks that provide charging, electric fleet operators, clean biofuel producers, and things like that. And this is just an example of how this program, as I said, we're the only state in the Western Seaboard that doesn't have it. And this is what it looks like in California. So you can see when it started in 2011, you had a very kind of small amount of clean alternative fuels being produced. And every single year the program existed, that amount has grown significantly. And this is volume of fuels. This is tons of carbon reduced, essentially. So you go from a little over 1 million tons in just the first year in California to close to 10 million tons last year, and that's continuing to accelerate. So this policy was introduced last year in the legislative session. They cleared 2 House committees and then didn't make it past the floor, and we're hoping to bring it back and kind of push it all the way this year. And then when the state did an analysis of what the low carbon fuel standard would do in Washington, it found significant, to validate the job creation point, the in-state Washington opportunity for job creation. They ran 8 scenarios for what does it mean to transition to lower carbon fuels, to transition off of oil and gasoline to electricity and clean sustainable biofuels. And they found in 7 of the 8 scenarios, they found significant job increases, up to 16,000 jobs created on an annual basis that would be sustained in Washington through producing domestic, locally produced electricity, through expanded charging infrastructure installation, capturing sustainable biofuel feedstocks like, if you ever go to McDonald's and you see them frying your fries, and right now they basically just dump that and it's waste. If we can turn that into a fuel, and that's a sustainable, clean fuel that reduces the waste streams as well. And so being able to capture that and supporting the use of those fuels is a clean alternative that makes sure that those folks that are still not transitioned off of electricity off of gasoline can be using more sustainable fuels as well. And then we have a set of kind of smaller specific EV policies specific to the kind of market transformation and deploying new electric vehicles. So there's a set of categories of incentives intended to deploy additional electric vehicles. An EV incentive, we had one up until May of this year, and it lapsed, unfortunately. When I found out we weren't going to pass it, that EV I bought that I mentioned earlier, I ran out and got it before the incentive passed, so it certainly stimulated at least one purchase. But what we saw was that when this EV incentive passed, the rate of sales of EVs in the state of Washington more than doubled over the course of between 1 month and the next. So this EV incentive we know has a very direct correlation and support for a kind of market expansion and deployment of these vehicles. And so we want to do what we can to bring it back. There's a lot of appetite in the legislature to do that, but there's budget constraints. There's a lot of things the legislature has to pay for that they're falling short on. So that's kind of the main obstacle. It's not does the legislature want to have an EV incentive? It's does it decide it can afford to? The next program is something called Charge Ahead, which is focused specifically, again, Washington Whole, California and Oregon both have this program. It is dedicated to low-income folks that drive older cars in air quality hotspots. It provides them a much richer, a larger incentive to retire their old vehicle, replace it with a newer used EV or public transit vouchers. So in doing so, kind of checking a number of boxes, supporting air quality improvement, deploying and increasing access for low-income folks to clean mobility, and supporting the resale value of electric cars, which drives new adoption as well. And then Washington State has an incentive for heavy-duty vehicles, trucks, vans, things like that, that has gotten better over the recent years, but is still underutilized. We want to kind of improve, widen, and fix it if we can. Another major policy or another important policy that we care about that'll come back is the ZEV Mandate. Are folks familiar with the ZEV Mandate? So I think I forget if it's 9 or 10 states have the ZEV Mandate. This may sound familiar, but on the Western Seaboard, Washington is the only state that does not have the ZEV Mandate. And it's a program that is designed and implemented by California, and other states can opt into it. That basically requires automakers to sell a certain volume of electric vehicles into that market. It's got more complexity than that, but that's the headline. So we really support this program because it supports market transformation, consumer access to EVs, the chart that you showed earlier with the kind of more and more EVs showing up. A lot of those are in California, not a lot of those are in Washington. So some of the bigger ones, out there, there's Leafs and Teslas and Volts and Bolts and things like that. Those are available. But when a lot of auto companies introduce new models, they introduce them to California as compliance cars, did not bring them to Washington, did not bring them to the Northeast, did not bring them to the rest of the country. And so the ZEV Mandate would not necessarily drive additional reductions in emissions, but it would drive market transformation and consumer access, and that's really important as well. And then we'll work on a number of kind of budget support items. The governor's budget, we anticipate having $10 to $15 million in it for investments in transportation, electrification, charging infrastructure, innovative solutions to charging, thinking better about how cars integrate with the electricity grid and things like that in the way that I was talking about earlier. So we'll be actively working on that. That'll be in the Clean Energy Fund. And another piece is something called the EV Infrastructure Bank. Electric vehicles pay a higher car tab fee to the state of Washington, and most of that is supposed to be going into EV infrastructure. They have not been doing that. Some of it has gone into that, but most of it is not. And so making sure that money gets redirected toward actually expanded access to charging and things like that is really important as well. There are other policies, but I would say those are the kind of core highlights that I would point out. And that's it. I'm happy to talk more. I just wanted to I could drone for a long time if you guys want, but I figured I would keep it more simple, maybe answer questions, but it's up to you what you want me to do. Sure. I mean, I know we'll have like a panel discussion about like ways to do this, but if there's questions about the policies, maybe I could do that now so that it doesn't. OSU there? Yeah, I think you raised your hand first. In Norway, you get free We don't want to set up a situation in the budget or in reality where transit and EVs are competing for dollars. And we support electrification, obviously, and we want to have the state put its money where its mouth is. But the ferry system struggles as it is, and we'd rather not take money away from that. I know that's been discussed and finding ways to backfill that, so that may happen. What's a few $100 million between friends, right? But I think that making sure that the money is kind of continues to remain in the transit and ferry place is pretty important.
The commercial EV incentive right now, I think, is that the one that's earmarked for the heavy duty?
So there is.
Repeat the question so people
Sure. The commercial EV incentive. What?
So it's through 2021 in the states.
So there is an incentive for vehicles, for medium and heavy duty vehicles that run on alternative fuels. It is not earmarked necessarily for private businesses or whatever, but it is for vehicles of a certain type, and it comes out of a certain type of taxes that principally businesses pay. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
You mentioned that the ZEV mandate program exists everywhere on the West Coast. Also,
So the ZEV mandate is a part of California's it's called a package of clean car rules that California is allowed to adopt, and other states can choose between federal standards and California standards, right? In 2005, my predecessors and other Climate Solutions and other groups worked to get Washington to adopt the clean car standards, and we adopted all 9 of them except for the ZEV mandate. 10 states, I believe, have adopted the clean car standards. The 3 states on the western seaboard, like I said, Oregon, Washington, and California, Washington accepting the ZEV mandate, and the north and most of the northeast states have adopted them as well. The low carbon fuel standard exists only in Oregon and California in the United States. It exists in British Columbia, the UK, and the EU as well. Versions of the kind of, alternative fuel directive essentially exist in those jurisdictions as well. Yeah, so the question was, what are ZEV standards? Sounds great. What's the problem, Washington legislature, right? That's the question. I don't, the auto companies really don't like it. I mean, General Motors actually interestingly just came out in favor of a national ZEV mandate that is actually richer than California's 25% by some year, 2030 or something like that. So maybe that's changing. Auto companies don't like it. They think it requires them to sell cars that the public doesn't want. Legislators are a little weary of something that forces sale, basically are sympathetic to that argument. But I would say that principally, I mean, I don't know what the arguments were in 2005. I wasn't around for that conversation back then, but it's principally just kind of a reluctance to drive that kind of requirement.
If one wanted to help support the lobbying effort to get the ZEV standard legislated, we use these references down here.
I don't know. I haven't seen that sheet. So it's somebody else's. I'll let someone else answer that question.
has the study been done on the amount of available renewable electricity that will be available in 2035, 2040 to be able to fully
Let my
supply
deck back up there.
vehicles?
So 1 second. Hold on. So the question was, is there enough clean power available by mid-century to serve all the demand, including the demand associated with electrification? And so this study, the way the state study, what they did was they figured out what are the energy demands associated with this pathway, including changes among all the, the ways we use energy and in what, sectors and end uses and things like that. and they created an hourly model for every day between now and 2050. So every hour of every day for the next 30 some years, 34 years, it was from 2016. They modeled the load portfolio profile, what the demand is associated with not just electrifying transportation, but not using gas and furnaces in homes anymore either. Heating water in spaces with electricity and heat pumps and things like that. So all of that kind of growing load, not just transportation. And then they mapped it back to electricity, to how can we generate the demand. So that's why you see here from 2016 through 2050, it shows what the resource mix by year is, and it's looking at that that demand associated with that electrification. Now again, that maybe is probably even too much fossil in there, and there's a bunch of other changes that I would make. But the point is that basically the answer is yes. When we did this, well, that's what they modeled. What they modeled was, can we select and source and cite all these?
Or do we need to increase our renewable energy requirements in order to get there?
Well, so the 100% clean policy will. That's why I think it's important to think about these things together. It's important to think about it. You know, if this was 1990 or 1980 or something like that, we can think about, you know what, we'll clean up electricity first, and then we'll worry about cars, and then we'll worry, because, you know, there's more time. But the point is that the pathway we have now? We have 30 years to do all of these things at once. And the reason that it's really important for Climate Solutions and other groups to pass 100% clean alongside transportation support policies is to make sure that as we expand that load, utilities are serving it with new clean resources. So that's why, yes. So the answer is yes, we do need both. We do need electricity sector policy.
Are the policies in place now?
No.
Or do we need to go to the legislature?
That's what I'm saying. That's why 100% clean is a part of the agenda. They are not in place now. Right now, Puget Sound Energy has about 2,000 megawatts of new fossil fuels in their current 20-year plan, presumably even more when they model coal closure and what happens after that 20-year time threshold. Avista has about 500 megawatts of the new fossil fuels. The policies are not there now, and that's why I came to an EV thing and said, let's work on electricity, because we need to do both. We can't do one and then assume the other one will come.
Will you have legislation?
Yes. Yes.
Almost everybody, 95% of 5-year total cost of ownership for an EV already less than a commercial vehicle. So for almost anybody, it doesn't make any financial sense to buy a commercial vehicle. And my extension of these analyses suggests that even people who aren't going out and buying a car, for almost everybody, it makes sense financially to switch to an EV. And so I guess my question is, why are we talking about going zero emissions in 20 years and not the next couple of years? Repeat the question. The same thing verbatim.
So basically the question is, why not faster? Yeah, I got it. So it's cost effective. Why shouldn't we do it faster? I mean, and we should do it faster. What we are as advocates are frequently put in the position to try and figure out what is the policy that can pass muster in a legislature, and so we make those choices. I mean, they're not always fun choices to make, but the recent polling on EV interest shows that about 20% of people would consider their next car being electric. What that shows is a huge potential market opportunity and expansion for electric vehicles, but it shows that 80% of people wouldn't want to do that. And so thinking about ways to drive market transformation, to expand availability of charging, things like that is really important. It's also not just cost. Do you live in a house with a garage? You do. Right. Well, that's not a minor issue. For a lot of people, the ability to have steady access to charging is a very significant problem, and that's why, in addition to policies that drive market expansion, we want to drive policies that support that market expansion as well. And so for us, that kind of suite of policies is really important, because the only obstacle is not cost. There's psychological obstacles. There's real physical obstacles to people being able to have access to charging, things like that. For us also, EVs are really important, and we support electrification, but that is the only thing worse than an EV is a gasoline car. But many other solutions are better than that. So infrastructure for biking, expanded transit, things like that. Those are solutions that get around the issue of do you have a car in a garage at home? They're broadly accessible. Those can and should be electrified. We've worked on policies to make sure the King County Metro does that. I can talk about that if people are interested. But the point is a comprehensive suite of solutions is really important. So it's important not to think about transportation as how many EVs can we get on the road, and what is the broad picture of transportation decarbonization.
There are many states, like Arizona, Colorado, Hawaii, why not? An obvious kind of model is another implicit incentive for people. Like, I made this choice. I was driving commuting to work in Arizona. I got a motorcycle.
Question is, why don't we allow EVs to access HOV lanes? I think there's been a lot of conversation about policies like that. Again, we want to incentivize multiple people driving in a car and protect and reserving those lanes for those purposes of priority.
So we have time for one more question. I have a question about equity for EVs, right? Because you've got a very high initial cost.
Mm-hmm.
What can we do, or what can be done to allow
Yeah.
insertion of EVs across
Yep.
different economic?
So the question is, how do we make sure that EVs are accessible not just to middle and high, or high, middle, and high income people? Basically, how do we broaden access to clean mobility? And I think so. It's a few things. So when we talk to equity groups around electrification, the Charge Ahead program is one of those things. Again, that's a richer incentive for folks that meet a certain set of criteria: older vehicle, low income, in an air quality, in a low airshed area. So expanding access and a larger incentive for folks to be able to access a car for that that meet those criteria. That's pretty important, actually, because if you're low, the federal one of the most important incentives for deploying that supports people purchasing an electric car is the federal tax incentive, about $7,500 a vehicle. That's an income tax incentive, and you can only take advantage of it if you have $7,500 worth of tax exposure, which many low-income people don't. About half the population pays nothing, and increasing portions pay smaller amounts than that. So not everyone can benefit from that tax benefit. So that's why Charge Ahead is one important way to provide that kind of financial support for folks that don't have that tax exposure that allows them to make a clean choice as well. I think the other kind of piece there is that when we talk to equity groups, one of the things they say is this is the reason we shouldn't just focus on EV deployment, but transportation electrification writ large. One of the reasons we work really closely with King County Metro to make sure that their all new buses after 2020 are electric. That's one of the reasons we worked on the heavy duty incentive, because a lot of the air quality issues, we were talking about diesel earlier, they're impacting folks are not coming from cars, they're coming from heavy duty vehicles that kind of operate in their neighborhoods. For one of the things that the city of Seattle has done, which I think is pretty great, is that their contract with Recology, which is the waste hauler that serves parts of the city, the northeast quadrant, I believe, they will be required to deploy 2 pilot electric refuse trucks. Eventually, they all need to be that way, but the point is deploying more and more of these, gradually and expanding that over time is really important. But the point is that when we think about electrification, we should think about incentives for used and new vehicles to go to low-income folks and the populations that you're talking about. But when we're talking about equity and transportation and the air pollution, it's the way we get at that, as we understand from our equity partners, is by looking at use cases that are not cars, but these other vehicles that are impacting air quality in neighborhoods across the city and across the state. Okay. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Vlad. And Matthew from Cultura will now be speaking to us about more electric vehicle policy.
Anyway, thanks so much for having me, Arvia and Jeremy and Andrew, and really appreciate being here. So I'm Matthew Metz. I'm co-executive director of Cultura. So Cultura was founded in 2014, and basically what we're about is getting America off gasoline. So yeah, this is a chart of gasoline consumption in Washington over the last 60 years. And you see since 1990, we've been pretty close, bumping up against 3 billion gallons a year. So even though our cars are getting a little bit more efficient, there's a lot more cars on the road, they're getting bigger. So basically we're at stasis. And, you know, and we don't even see changes coming from the EVs that have been coming in the market in the last, 5 or 6 years. It's still, we're still basically stuck close to 3 billion gallons a year. It's about 35% of our CO2 is just from on-road vehicles. So there's two basic approaches to addressing climate issues. So one, and we've heard about that quite a bit from Vlad, are kind of more market-based approaches that would include carbon taxes, low carbon fuel standards, EV incentives, a lot of these things that where the government says, look, we're going to make it either easier or harder for you to do something. We're going to make gas a little bit more expensive. We're going to make EVs a little bit cheaper. And this has basically been the trend in environmental policy for the last 30, 40 years. Kind of out of the University of Chicago and free market economics came the idea that you don't really want to restrict choices. You want to have broad choice to do things. And if you want to discourage a behavior, the best thing you do is just make it a little bit more costly. But there's another approach that was, very successful, which is regulation. So an Endangered Species Act is one example of regulation. Unleaded gasoline, catalytic converters, seat belts, airbags. So it's where you basically tell manufacturers, look, you got to do something. This is the way it's going to be. We don't care what it costs. Find a way. And usually what happens is the manufacturers, scream about it. Oh, we'll never be able to afford it. This is ridiculous. But a lot of times, they find a way to make it happen. So I've been working with Representative Macri on a phase-out bill. And so there's two parts to this phase-out bill. There's a public fleet portion and there's a private vehicle portion. So the public vehicle portion says that all passenger light-duty vehicles that are operated by the state of Washington, and there's tens of thousands of them, have to be EVs. Well, the new ones have to be EVs by 2023. So the state has to get out of the business of buying gas cars by 2023 and by 2026 for medium and heavy duty vehicles. And then the same for city and county vehicles, except the dates are pushed back a year or two. So actually, Washington right now has one of the most aggressive public fleet statutes already on the books from about 10 years ago. And what that says is that all public vehicles, actually after June 30th, 2018, need to be electric or non-polluting to the extent practicable. And so, it was a great idea at the time, but what's happened is it's basically largely been ignored. And I'll talk about it a little bit more, but Cultura did a big report on it that came out in June that says, basically 99% of vehicles in the public fleet are still, gas or diesel burning. And so this part of the bill would say, look, we're taking the discretion away from the cities and from the state to keep adding gas vehicles to their fleet. And instead, you just have to buy electric, too bad. And then the other portion of the bill is a 2035 private passenger vehicle phase out. And what that says is that, yeah, you can't buy a gas burning car after 2035. If in 2034 you buy one, yeah, you can keep it for 15 years, but you just can't buy a new one. And in Washington, we buy about 300,000 new vehicles every year. And right now, I think a little under 10,000 are EVs. But yeah, the vast, so we're bringing vast numbers of gas burning vehicles that will have a life of 15 years or so. So it's not a good thing. And so we're trying to put an end date to it. And the advantage of a phase out is it doesn't just have effect in the year 2035, but it really starts to have a positive effect almost immediately. And so just for example, the automakers know that, okay, the only way we're going to be selling vehicles in Washington and California, we're also working on this in California, by the way, and in other states, but the only way that we're going to be able to sell vehicles is if they're EVs. So we better, be positioned, we better be ready. Because what's happened right now is that, like the Bolt and the Volt and, GM and other manufacturers, they spend a lot of money developing these cars, but the markets haven't been there for them. They're only selling like 1,500 Bolts a month right now. And it's basically flatlined. It hasn't increased. And so they're saying, well, why should we spend the $5 billion that it takes to build a pickup or a new SUV or something like that when, there hasn't been much of a demonstrated market for anything besides Teslas. So this would guarantee them a big market to sell into. Likewise, utility and charging providers. So the, why should we install charging when we don't know how big the market is going to be? It could be, if we continue selling, in Washington only, let's say 1,000 EVs a month, it's not going to support a big charging network. So why should we put our money in there? But if there's a mandated phase out, it says, look, you're going to have a large guaranteed market. So yeah, we can go ahead and invest, knowing that that market is going to be here. Likewise for landlords, so like in apartment buildings right now, they're building apartment buildings all the time with little or no EV charging, because or parking. So again, it would send a signal to them that, hey, the long-term value of this building is going to be dependent upon whether there's available charging. So yeah, this is just a slide showing basically the coalition in California. So California introduced this legislation in last year. It was main difference was that it called for a 2040 phase out of private vehicles. It also didn't address public fleets. But we put together a pretty big coalition, and it's actually grown quite a bit since then. And more groups are coming in. Actually, let me just go one more slide. Okay, I'll go here. Okay, so there are some questions about phase outs. It's a new policy, and there's questions. Well, is this too radical? Can it work? Is it legal, etc.? So I'm just going to take them really quick. So federal preemption. So under the Clean Air Act, it's a federal statute. There's a decision from the Supreme Court that says only the federal government can make emissions regulations. And there's an exception for California and states that follow California. But there are ways to try to get around that. And for example, the draft bill doesn't talk about emissions. It just talks about the benefits of electrification, of EVs, and so it's not technically an emissions bill, or it could be viewed as such. There's also other measures in there that would kind of delay judicial review of it and make it hard for it to be preempted, at least over the short term. There's effect on low-income households. So, that's a important issue. But first of all, you have to remember that the mandate is not going to go into effect until 2035. Also, one point I think that's important to understand is that low-income people aren't buying new cars anyway. The people that new cars are really, for the most part, only bought by the top 10% of the population. There was a question out there, well, how can we make EVs affordable? And the answer is to basically have more in the market, and more new EVs will be old EVs or older EVs, and they'll become more affordable. And so it's a way of bringing those into the market. One big issue that's come up is, well, how about the gas tax? If our cars are powered by electricity, how are we going to pay for our roads? And that is a legitimate question. I think Jeff Finn here is working on a study, as part of a study that's working on how to deal with that. Basically, the answer is to charge by how far a vehicle goes, and so. That's a big question, but we didn't want to tie it to this bill because it's such a huge, major question with so many stakeholders that it would just, almost be like the, elephant wagging the tail or something like that. okay, so the last issue is political feasibility. You know, does anyone really think that, you know, given that, you know, 90-something% of people are driving around in gas cars, that they'd really be willing to pass legislation that one day we'd have a different standard? You know, and that's an interesting question. It really hasn't been tested very well here. We know in Europe that yeah. So anyway, it really hasn't been tested, but you know, there is this concept that's called Overton's window, and so basically, when you introduce legislation that is outside of the norm, you actually it starts to expand of what's considered, you know, acceptable, what's sensible, what's radical. And actually some of the for example, some of the policies that Vlad was talking about that maybe were sort of on the edge of what would be considered acceptable start to become more normal, more normalized, more in the very center of it. So it does, first of all, by having something a little bit more out there, it normalizes a lot of other policies that maybe have struggled. It makes them seem like very centrist. And secondly, you start to expand the window of where we are. I mean, right now, you know, everyone, the IPCC report that Jeremy referred to, it's a, you know, we need to take big action. And this phase out is basically the biggest pill that's out there. It's the strongest medicine that we have. It's the one that we know will result in big effects. I mean, some of these other policies, like, you know, having a little more money for charging and things like that, those are all great, but we don't know what effect that is. I mean, it's possible we'll still have 80% of people driving around gas cars in 10 years, even though we have a little bit more incentives for them. Okay, just lastly, so I just talk about electrifying local fleets. So yeah, Bellevue at the end of 2017 had 528 vehicles, only 4 EVs. King County, 1,999, only 9 EVs. So, you know, this is something that can be done. You know, we already have the law in the books. It's just a question of holding these local jurisdictions accountable. So if people don't, you know, want to focus solely on passing new legislation, but sort of working with the legislation we have, a lot of these, like city council, King County council, those are soft targets. Those are people that believe in climate change, that are concerned, that want to do things. But, you know, fleets and the public vehicles have just sort of been left to the side. It's, you know, just the crusty fleet managers that are managing them. But there is an opportunity really to start putting pressure on local jurisdictions and getting more traction with them. The other thing I'd say about the phase out, okay, how about one more minute? It's just, is this idea of putting gasoline on trial, is really having a public conversation about gasoline and its role in our lives and our society. And so this legislation is congruent with that. It's saying, hey, we need to phase out gasoline and have a discussion about why, and not just leave it to a bunch of really complex incentive programs that no one, you know, the average citizen doesn't understand very well. So you know, we wanted basically to get it to be like, you know, cigarettes, you know, something that people realize that it's outside of that driving a gas car is ultimately an antisocial act. It is. It's antisocial. It's bad for people. But to have that discussion really come in and people understand it. Okay. Anyway, thanks.
All right, thank you, Matthew. And we are going to take a little bit of a break until about 3:05, and then we will get started on the next part of our program. So yeah, go ahead, use the restroom, and yeah, we will reconvene in about 10 minutes or so.
All right, I will give everybody a chance to find their seats and calm down, maybe digest that cookie that they had at break. Yeah, that's a great question. It's just a really great question. Is that the goldfinch? Oh, it's the goldfinch. Yeah, I do know our state bird. Yeah. So let me first thank Arvia and the organizers today for inviting me. It's really great to be here presenting with Matt and Vlad, and just having the opportunity to talk to you today about what is one of the most important pieces of actually realizing the vision that Matthew and Vlad are talking about, and that's how to be a constituent lobbyist. First of all, just a little bit of background. Audubon Washington is a part of the National Audubon Society. Many of you, or some of you, might be Audubon members of like the Seattle chapter, maybe the Tahoma chapter. We are the state level organization that works in Olympia with partners like Climate Solutions, like Environment Washington, like WEC, the Washington Environmental Council, to advocate for policies that that move the needle on climate and clean energy. Audubon did a huge study in 2014, kind of profiling the expected range for birds across North America, and found that unmitigated climate change means that there could be declines of 80% in some of the keystone bird species across North America. And as I was joking with somebody before, why I care about birds? Well, birds are, it's cliche, but birds are the canary in the coal mine for ecosystems. And they're also just, people enjoy them. And there's something to be said for that. And we'll talk a little bit about that in terms of how you talk to decision makers about, making it personal and being accessible and being, not being afraid to talk about what you enjoy and what you love. I'm Adam Maxwell. I'm the campaign manager and government relations manager for Audubon Washington, and I'm going to talk to you about your role in advancing climate and clean energy policy in the state of Washington. So how many of you know Schoolhouse Rock? Awesome. So I used to teach college, and almost none of my students knew what Schoolhouse Rock was, and it was the most depressing part of my job, because everything I've learned about how government works is from Schoolhouse Rock, and my knowledge just stopped there. What are the roles of a constituent lobbyist? So, we're trying to get Bill across the finish line. What is your role? Well, a lot of folks would think that it's about just talking to your legislator and telling him what you want. Like, it's simple. It's a simple, making sure that your voice is heard. And there's, a lot of different interest groups coming in and talking to legislators, but they're accountable to you because you vote for them. It's that simple. Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. There's a few different things that are really key to constituent lobbying. The first is not looking at the meeting that you have with your legislator, or the email that you send, or the phone call that you make as a single moment in time, and you're like a one and done, a kind of quid pro quo. Whether your legislator and you agree on a variety of issues or not, it's really important to build a relationship with them. This goes for your legislator. This goes for maybe your city council person. It goes for decision makers in general. You want to be remembered by your legislator when they're thinking about how they're going to vote on a given policy. And the best way to do that is to consistently form a relationship. It's not just about that one meeting. It's about getting to know them a little bit and having them get to know you a little bit beyond just what your demands are. So it goes to the very basics of just being friendly, of saying hi and thank you for taking this time. Again, even if you completely disagree with them, being friendly to their staff, telling them a little bit about yourself in terms of your personal story. That's going to be a theme that comes up a lot. If you go in there and you, no offense to Vlad or Matthew, but just show them a bunch of numbers and show them a bunch of statistics and charts and make really rational arguments. Not that rational arguments are problematic, but the personal story that you can tell, the concerns that you have, the vision you have for the world and what you want it to be like are in some cases just as important for your legislator to hear, to build that relationship, to build that sense of trust and camaraderie with your legislator as every chart in the world. So that's really key. Another important part of being a constituent lobbyist is really essentially being an organizer. You're just one person, or you and your partner or a friend or two. That's great, but until we create a sense for the legislator that the community in general that they're from, their broad constituency that they represent, is supportive of aggressive clean energy policies that are going to address the magnitude of the climate crisis, they may not act. They're going to be hearing from lobbyists from the fossil fuel companies, from utility companies, from other interest groups that just say, you know, this isn't worth the expense, or we just can't, you know, this is not something that we can do right now. So creating a strong network of other advocates in your community is really key. And part of that is really getting to know and understand what your legislator, what moves them. And part of that is just, you know, we just finished you know, an initiative campaign where a lot of volunteers were coming together and working together on a ballot initiative, and the energy there was great. But if we're going to be able to move the needle in the legislature, we need that kind of energy in communities year round. You know, the few months before an election happens are really important, and people get really excited about it, and that's totally understandable. But you know, in December, January, February, getting business owners to put a 100% clean for Washington sticker up in their window, finding a business owner that is the coffee shop that your legislator goes to and having them put that sticker up in their window, that has a huge impact. Organizing is key, and organizing your community is one of the most important things you can do. And then 3, helping to create buzz about climate and clean energy. How many people in the room have ever written a letter to the editor? Okay, well, this is you know, a biased crowd, I think, but that's great. So that's really important, and it's something that you know, my field organizer Ben and we work with a lot of folks on writing letters to the editor at key moments. Having a relationship with an organization that can help you figure out what those moments are that a letter to the editor needs to get published, and also what your legislator and their staff needs to hear. Legislators, you know, they usually do read their local paper, or at least have their staff read it. And if there's something, yeah, now I know, I'm being naive. They have their staff read it, and if there's something that is really relevant to the work they're doing, or they're even more so if they're named, they're going to see that letter to the editor. And so creating that buzz, whether it's through letters to the editor, working with a local business owner or community leader to actually place an opinion piece, an op-ed, or, you know, using social media or whatever other, you know, Nextdoor. I don't know if any of you are on Nextdoor, using those kinds of technologies and mediums for communication to really create a sense of buzz and or of an inevitability around the need for these kinds of policies in your community is another key. So those are 3, you know, in my mind, those are the 3 roles of the constituent lobbyist. Maybe in the Q&A we'll think of some others, but those are the 3 key roles. So talked about this already a little bit, but ultimately how you can help ensuring legislators pass bold climate legislation, letters to the editors and op-eds, getting local businesses, community organizations all in, and then during the legislative session, that kind of direct lobbying, making sure that you have a relationship with an organization that you trust, that to kind of guide you and know when those important dates are, so that you can generate a flood of phone calls, so that you can participate in a phone bank where you actually help get others in your community to make phone calls. These are all tactics that we at Audubon Washington deploy, and you know, we welcome folks' support in those tactics. And then you know, making those appointments and relationship building with your legislators. Now is not too early to do that. And you know, we already are working with a number of key legislators to set up meetings in November and December. We're going to have a major lobby day in January, at the end of January. So those are the kinds of things that you can do to help immediately. I just want to kind of, you know, we talked a lot about policy in the first couple of presentations, but just kind of give a sense of the calendar and what we're looking at if we're going to pass substantial legislation like the 100% clean energy bill, like the low carbon fuel standard, which are you know, the 2 top policy areas for Audubon Washington. Right now, as I said, we're doing targeted in-district constituent meetings with some key legislators. On December 8th, there's going to be a 100% clean energy campaign kickoff event where we're going to dive much deeper into some of these topic areas, you know, whether it be you know, that relationship building with your legislator, whether it be a letter to the editor writing, and social media advocacy, or that kind of organizing of community leaders and business owners in your community. We're going to kick off the event, get that energy moving, and have some workshops on how to best be a citizen advocate. And then, what did I do? So then January 29th, we're going to have the Environmental Priorities Coalition is having a lobby day. Their number one actually their only climate policy of the Environmental Priorities Coalition is the 100% clean electricity bill. We got really close last session, and this session we're going to pass it. But to do that, we need to show up at the very beginning of session. It starts on January 14th. So about 2 weeks into session, have a very big showing for 100% clean energy at this lobby day. So, you know, mark that on your calendars. We'd love to have you come out. We'll work with you to set up meetings with your legislators, and it's a great day. We hope that you can make it out for that big lobby day. The calendar's not out yet for the legislative session. They don't put that out until, like, I don't know, first week of session. They really wait to the last minute. But based on the last time there was a full length session, we can kind of roughly estimate that anything that's going to survive in the legislative session, anything that's going to have a chance of passing overall, has to be out of the chamber that it originated in by roughly the first week of March. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this process. So if you are, and I'm kind of taking it down to too low of a level, I apologize. But a bill has to come through a committee. It has to get out of its policy committee of origin and that's not on here, but that's going to be roughly mid-February. So the policy debate has to happen in a committee. The legislators have to pass it out of a committee, and there's a cutoff deadline that if it doesn't get out of that committee by, it's a dead bill. It's not going to go anywhere that year. There's another one for if it has a fiscal impact, it has to be out of that committee by about a week later. And then the big cutoff is illustrated here is in early March. And that means that it has to be voted off of the floor. The House or Senate, whichever chamber it originated in, has to pass it out of their chamber by roughly first week of March if it's going to have any chance of ultimately passing. And so then there's another deadline that's kind of mid-March, April in the second chamber, and then the session ends in April. So it's a sprint. So, you know, I mentioned keeping up that energy of kind of campaigning that we had during 1631 around carbon pricing. We can keep up that kind of energy for, you know, 4 or 5 months. We can actually get some bold climate legislation passed and get a really big win, which is something I think we all know that we need right now on clean energy. Okay, so just kind of backing up a little bit and thinking about, how am I on time, by the way?
You're good.
Good? Okay, cool. So just thinking strategically about how to lobby. The premise here is sometimes, although we might want to be the person to talk to our legislator, maybe we are not the person to talk to our legislator. Maybe there's somebody else that we can help recruit. Maybe there's somebody else that we know that can help recruit somebody to talk to our legislator. So, I mean, it's tough to kind of step back and think that way, but you know, oftentimes the more we get to know our legislator, the more we know that the kinds of voices that they listen to are not our kinds of voices. Maybe they need to hear from somebody who's you know, more tied into the labor movement. Maybe they need to hear from a business owner. Maybe they you know, need to hear from somebody who's a scientific voice in the community. So getting to know your legislator, target as they're put here. So I guess I'm glad there's no legislators in the room. Calling them a target, maybe not the best thing to do in front of a legislator, but getting to know them, really doing your research on how they voted in the past on this issue and others. Again, if you understand how they voted on labor issues or education issues, you might be able to better understand what are the kinds of things that are going to move them, what are the kinds of stories that you can tell that are really going to be compelling to them. Even if you're ultimately talking about clean energy, maybe if they're really interested in education, you talk about young people more, and you talk about the need to protect the future to protect the climate for future generations, and the value of you know, for us at Audubon, the value of nature for educating young people and helping them to become full-formed human beings. So what other issues does your legislator care about? What groups in town your legislator might be influenced by? So do they go to a church? Are they a part of a faith community? Are they a member of the Rotary Club? Are they, as I mentioned before, do they go to a specific coffee shop or hold their meetings at a specific restaurant? These are the kinds of things that organizers typically call power mapping. It's really getting to understand the full array of influences that can help drive a legislator's decision making. So really understanding that, and then as I said, knowing thyself, really knowing you. Are you the person your legislator needs to hear from? Are there other things that you could be doing that in addition to meeting with your legislator, but are there other things that you could be doing, such as writing letters to the editor, presenting to a local Rotary Club, presenting to a faith group, getting other people in your community on board with the vision of 100% clean or electric vehicle future, getting people on board with that and getting them engaged and involved with actually meeting with your legislator. So when you're lobbying, what to do. Make it personal, tell your story. One of the big things people do, to skip ahead, what not to do, is trying to be an expert. So really the thing that you want to have down pat and be able to tell in a compelling way is your personal story. You don't need to have all the facts on hand in that moment. It's more important to get across your personal story. We at Audubon, and I'm pretty sure Climate Solutions field staff, can get you fact sheets to leave behind with the legislator that'll have some of that detailed information on it. But the thing that you should be doing in that meeting is really telling your compelling story of why you think that they should act on this. And the other thing that's really good about not being an expert is getting to say, I don't know. And most people don't like saying I don't know, but going back to the relationship building component of this, if you can say I don't know and I'm gonna get back to you on something, that is so key. It creates an automatic follow-up plan for you and that decision maker, so that you can come back and share something with them and say, hey, check out this study from the National Renewable Energy Lab. Let me know what you think about it. It shows that solar and storage are outcompeting gas right now, and will in 10 years be able to completely decimate fossil fuels. What do you think about that? Then you start a dialogue, and you've actually started to build a relationship because you said I don't know, because you had the bravery to say I don't know. I know most of us don't like to say it. Stay focused, be prepared. Reach out to me if you want afterwards. I meant to bring them but didn't have time to print. We've got a full guide that's about a 4-page detailed guide on how to prepare for one of these meetings. I'd be happy to pass that along as a digital version. So really be prepared, prepare asungside the other people that are going to be in the meeting with you. Have somebody that's keeping time, have somebody that's going to make sure that the legislator gets the leave behind, the fact sheets, whatever it might be. But it's really important to stay organized and be prepared to be fully respectful of the decision maker's time. Try to anticipate the arguments of your opponents. And this is a place where organizations that you work with can be really helpful. So whether it's Audubon Washington, Climate Solutions, Cultura, sorry, I think I made a hybrid of your organization and Forterra. Really try to understand what the opponent's arguments are going to be, and have a sense of what you're going to say in response to that is really important. And usually the arguments are going to be about cost, because that's just kind of the way folks think. So and then make sure that you show gratitude and respect, and just always be very thankful for the opportunity to even be able to tell your story. So don't ramble on, don't be unprofessional or combative. I mean, these should be obvious things, but when you're working to build that relationship and you're working with others, it's really good to be on the same page and make sure that everybody understands that no matter how much you disagree with a legislator, no matter how much you're frustrated by their unwillingness to maybe support the policy right now, that you're not getting combative, and you're not trying to turn it into an argument. That's frankly, that just doesn't work. Legislators aren't going to be moved by a constituent getting aggressive and angry with them and being combative. There's other ways to approach a legislator that doesn't agree with you on the issue, and that goes back to what I was talking about with organizing. You've got to create that sense of community desire for the policy you're pushing for, because you as one person yelling at them doesn't ultimately threaten their chances of re-election, and that's ultimately what they have to be concerned about. Again, don't try to be an expert. Saying I don't know is really valuable, but you do want to try to get a commitment one way or another. You don't want to leave the meeting unsure of what they're going to do. You don't want to leave the meeting not getting a solid commitment that they're going to support the legislation you want, or not getting a solid commitment that they're saying, no, I'm just not going to support this at this moment. And then you ask them why. And that's really important, that last piece, asking them why, asking them what they don't think is adequate or compelling about this policy. And the reason for that is, as a constituent lobbyist, you're really part of a team that lobbies the legislature. There's folks like myself and Vlad who are down in Olympia. There are our contract lobbyists that we have that are actually building relationships in the building with the legislator. Those are the folks that actually can provide that expertise, and being able to get that feedback from you when you meet with your legislator about what their worries are in terms of whatever policy you're talking with them about, what their concerns are, or what they're excited about. If they're excited about a piece of it but not the rest of it, it's really important and helpful for us to know that, so that when we're talking to them in Olympia, we can be better advocates for the issues that you care about. So again, yeah, to learn more, we've got a clean energy kickoff event. We're still trying to finalize the location of that, but it's likely to be on the east side of the lake, not east side of the mountains. Don't worry. It's going to be on December 8th, and it's going to be likely to be in the afternoon. So that's a Saturday. Again, we're still finalizing the location, and we'll have a location probably by midweek this week. And yeah. Oh, sure. And then there's one more bird. There's my email address and phone number if you have any questions. And then there is one more bird that I'm going to show you. Oh, okay. Before you can ask me what it is.
Folks on the phone are wondering how important is participation in the utilities IRP process?
That is an important piece of the puzzle. And that's, that being said, I think there's more that so the question for folks in the audience, how important is participation in the utilities integrated resource planning process? I will say to a certain extent, I don't know as much as somebody like Vlad does. So I said, I don't know, good for me. The integrated resource planning process can be improved quite a bit and can be updated to better reflect the trajectory that we need to go in terms of clean energy planning. And so public participation is key in those kinds of processes. But at the legislative level, we need to improve the overall way in which those planning processes take place if we're going to hit our goals of 2050. You want to chime in on that?
Sure. So a number of groups kind of in the NGO world and the nonprofit world participate in the integrated resource plans, Climate Solutions, Renewable Northwest, and others, Sierra Club, do really important, great work there. It's good for, it's a forum for utilities to understand that their public, their customers and constituents want cleaner energy, but ultimately the real significant, high value, highly leveraged changes that can be achieved are from a grassroots perspective, I should say, are changing laws, changing statutes, and requiring utilities to make different choices. So I encourage folks to participate in the IRPs, and I encourage folks to participate in the legislature. But if you have to choose one, I would choose the legislature.
What was your name? Charles? Oh, okay. Sure. Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, how are you wanting to have the Perfect. Okay. That should be correct. Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. All right. All right. Hi, my name is Andrew Kidda, and I've been a climate activist for about 5 years. I do a lot of work with 350 Seattle, and I started the transportation team there. A lot of the work we do is really focused on the city and on transit and ped bike stuff, but I also am really fascinated and engaged with the EV question. So yeah, I want to thank all the panelists for really great presentations. I'd also like to start with an acknowledgement that's very common in our organization, and that is to acknowledge that we are here today on stolen Duwamish land, and just take a moment to consider what that means. This is a community that occupied this land for hundreds and thousands of years without causing the kinds of devastation that our culture has wrought in a very short period of time. So, I also want to say that I have been struggling recently as a climate activist. I really appreciate Vlad for your mentioning the phrase "this is not enough." You were looking at some of the mixes that were on your trajectory and saying this is not enough. And that has become very clear to us, with the recent IPCC report, which says, we basically have 12 years to get off carbon emission. And then that was followed by a report that said, actually, the oceans are warming quite a lot faster than we thought, and that is really bad. And it means that all the models we had before are probably underestimating the need for action. So, that's very tough news. And then we find ourselves here at this point in history, and 1631 doesn't pass. And it's very devastating. And I also want to appreciate Adam for saying, I think it was you, for saying we need a win. And I think that's right. And so here we are today talking about maybe can we get a win in the field of EVs. And so I want to start with a question for Adam, actually. And I want to ask you what you heard here from the other two panelists was two quite different visions of EV legislation going down to Olympia. And I think that they probably have sponsors for the most part. And in previous years, we've had sometimes a plurality of different bills going forward. I think there were 4 carbon taxes last year, jockeying for position down in Olympia. And for me as an activist, I found that very confusing. I was trying to, track this one. I knew this one was in secret negotiations over there. I didn't know how to do that. So I guess what I'd like to ask you is what advice do you give this audience of activists to best participate in what might be a kind of complex legislative process on EVs?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and it's a good question because it doesn't have easy answers. One of the things, so a lot of the presentation I gave was about relationship building, right? Relationship building with your legislator, relationship building in your community. I think that also, one maybe neglected point in there was relationship building with an organization, frankly, or several, with folks who work in the NGO space or in the nonprofit environmental space, really understanding what their priorities are, what their theories of change are, and really getting a sense of, do you trust their analysis? And, I know we at Audubon, I've only been there for, I think, maybe almost 2 months at this point. So I wasn't there in the last legislative session. But I know that we publish a weekly digest that talks about what bills are moving and what bills are not moving, and what's going on. I'm not sure if Climate Solutions does a similar thing, but we work with our partners in Olympia to develop a kind of understanding of what bills have the best shot at going, getting past the mileposts that there are, and share that with our folks that are on our list. So, I mean, yeah, sign up for our list is one thing you can do. I think the other thing is, going back to the storytelling part, if we're going to pass, if we're going to get a win, as you said, as I said, if we're going to get a win, we need to create that sense for legislators that if they don't pass something substantial, they're going to have consequences. And part of what that means is, advocating at the broadest level for very quick and substantial action. And if that means, we get the 100% clean electricity policy passed, but maybe not the ZEV mandate, or maybe not that low carbon fuel standard, we're creating momentum, and that's really important. So yeah, I would say, creating that relationship with trusted sources, making sure that when you're building that relationship, you're building that broadest sense of the need for action, both from yourself and from others in your community. And that makes the job of advocating in Olympia a lot easier. It makes it much more possible that we're going to get things moving and get them past those cutoff deadline mileposts in time to make sure that we get that win.
Great, thank you. My next question is for both Vlad and Matthew. And it really has to do with how to integrate the two approaches. Correct me if I'm wrong, Matthew, but I feel that you feel that introducing this gasoline phase-out bill is worth doing even if it doesn't pass this year. In other words, that whole question of shifting the conversation. And Vlad, my sense is from you, based on this may not be enough, that your goal is more to try and get something passed, knowing that it doesn't do everything and we've got to do more after that. So those are complex, different dynamics. And I guess I would like to ask each of you, how would you best integrate those two as we move forward through the legislative year in a strategy down in Olympia? And it doesn't matter to me who goes first.
I would say none of the bills anyone has talked about today is enough. Preventing the sales of fossil fuel driven cars by 2035 is also not enough. That's not a criticism, just to be clear. It's that 80% trajectory that I showed everyone kind of at the beginning. That's not enough. We need to move aggressively on a transition. We need to create date certains for the end of the use of kind of highly emitting resources, and we need to promote policy that drives that transformation aggressively and quickly. We need to do all of those things. I struggle. I'm in my third year at Climate Solutions, and I'm a registered lobbyist and an advocate, and this is all I do. I wake up and I think about climate, and I work, and then I go home and I read papers, and I'm here on a Sunday and doing other stuff when I go home. Like, this is all I do, and I worry a lot about this idea of what is enough and is what we're doing enough? And the answer is absolutely, aggressively, emphatically, we are not. But I would also say that the Washington State Legislature hasn't passed major climate legislation since 2005. 2018, in case anyone's counting. We have about 22 years if you kind of look at the mid-century kind of goalpost. We have 12 years if you look at what the IPCC has said. And so I think we need to, the way we integrate these kind of, all the way policies versus kind of the first step policies, you just got to do everything. I think we need to be introducing legislation that that initiates and pushes forward a conversation. But a lot of the times, the environmental community in particular, progressive communities in general, are so fixated on the thing that starts the conversation, they're not also fixated on the things that can move the ball forward and get it across the finish line. So my answer is we need to do both. We need to make sure that in doing the thing that's exciting, we're not also doing the thing, we don't stop doing the thing that's going to cut millions of tons over the course of the next several years. We need to do both, and only focusing on the one that we know is enough to the exclusion of the one that we know will cut millions of tons over the next several years. That's the thing we have to be careful of. We have to do both. So that's my answer.
Yeah, I totally agree. The only other thing I'd add is that I do think that the sort of economist, lawyer, technocrat axis has got a really strong grip over climate communication. And it's really hard for people to understand this. I mean, glad these are great policies, but can they be translated so that ordinary people can understand that they can feel that they participate in it, that they have a stake in it, or do they just have to trust that that's the case? And the thing I like about gasoline is that it's a product that everyone relates to. Everyone knows it. It's really stuck inside our society or inside our lives. And I think that sort of talking about it and bringing it out and like talking about that process of untangling ourselves from it is really healthy. And a lot of climate policy is it's about other people. It's utilities, it's oil companies, it's all these people that are far away. But gasoline's sort of unique in that it's within us. And so I think this idea of sort of having a movement, a true movement about climate, about fossil fuels, it sort of has to start at home to a certain extent and be rooted in experience that people really understand. It's ultimately, I think, the solution, partly it's technocratic, but partly it's more of an emotional, spiritual, coming forth, something like that. So.
Great, thank you. All right, okay, here's a question that I got in, not one of mine. And I think it's for Vlad. What is the last year utilities can build new natural gas plants and we can still get to 100% clean electricity?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of a complicated question. The life expectancy of a new central station generating facility is 35 to 40 years. So we're essentially, if we're talking about a 2045 or 2050 deadline, certainly anyone sooner, we're already past the point of being able to build new fossil fuel plants. I think that the sort of complicated factor is that not all methane comes from fossil, and so some utilities, for example, across the country are looking at renewable sources of gas and things like that. So there's complexity there. Our basic contention is that even if what utilities want to do and plan on doing is using, for example, renewable natural gas, which is what comes from landfills and like dairies, and it's stuff that's going to be emitted anyway. Even if they're going to do that. And we should not assume that that's a good idea, but even if they are going to do that, we have more than enough of that infrastructure already so that we don't need to build another one of those. There is no need to build a new thermal central station generating facility. Even if we do use them in a clean future, we don't need a new one. And so, I showed a slide from some of the research that we did. What Washington, or the Northwest, I should say, needs, according to that model, was 15,000 megawatts of new solar, 12,000 megawatts of new wind, something like 7,000 megawatts of new storage, all kinds of demand-sided solutions, a variety of things like that to get the job done. It's not a bunch of new gas-type generation. So the last state is probably like 10 years ago, is maybe the answer to that question. And whether or not they will be using that technology, that category of technology, they don't need to build a new one anymore, for sure.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, I got another question here that I think Matthew can best handle, although others can chime in. What needs to be done to develop the EV culture? How can we educate people about EVs?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Are we living in a gasoline culture? Is there enough aspect there of like plugging in your car, you know, to create a real culture around it. And I think ultimately the culture has to be an environmentally focused one, that, you know, we're people that care about the environment, and that's why we do it. And frankly, I think that that's really been missing from the EV, you know, culture to the extent it exists right now, is that you know, it's completely acceptable to continue using gas cars. So like socially, it's totally acceptable. No one will say anything. It's like buying bread. And that needs to change. It needs to, like, that idea of stigma coming down on gasoline use, where, you know, you tell someone that just brought a new car, why'd you do that? Or, you know, that really needs to change. So I think that sort of consciousness that burning gasoline is wrong, and that as EV drivers, that's what we have in common, is that we've decided not to do that, that we're excising that from our lives. I think that's really important.
Can I add to that? So I don't disagree that actually, you know, one of the things that Adam was talking about in, you know, lobbying your legislator, those are lobbying rules for whoever it is you're lobbying. So, and one of the rules was, I forgot how you phrase it, but it's like, know your audience, essentially. It's like, know what this person cares about. And I sometimes, you know, when I try and, you know, tell somebody about how great an EV is, sometimes I tell them about carbon or whatever, or pollution. Greenhouse gas pollution. Sometimes I talk about air quality instead of climate change pollution, because maybe that's the thing that person cares about more. And most of the time I don't talk about any of those things. I talk about the fact that I haven't been to a gas station since I bought this thing. I talk about the money I'm saving on it. I'm talking about, you know, depending on who it is, it's faster than most of the cars that you can buy, if that's the kind of thing the person's talking about. You know, for a very long time, the environmental story has been, do this thing because it's the right thing to do, and not because it necessarily makes your life better or more fun or more exciting. Electric cars are better than gasoline cars. They're just better. They cost less. They're faster. They're more convenient because you don't have to like think about going to fill up. You know, you're rushing into a meeting and you're gonna be 10 minutes late because you have to stop and get gas on it. Like there is a story to tell about the clean energy transition that applies to electric cars and to zero emission cars, applies to a lot of other things as well. And we need to start, I think, the environmental community needs to start not just talking about the ills that we're avoiding, but offering a vision of how the future that we're offering people is better than the one they have now. You know, we talk a lot about like, you know, this whatever, we do this climate station, I'm not criticizing anybody. You know, this particular, we have to stop this project because it'll have these bad effects. That's true, we should tell that story. We should also tell a story about how our lives will be better as a result of achieving the thing that we're gonna do. 100% clean electricity, achieving the transition will save money on energy. Our air will be cleaner, our lives will be longer, we'll live healthier, we'll have more fun driving around if that's what we're going to do. You know what I mean? We have to tell a story about what we're offering is better, and not just about how it's avoiding harms.
Can I just add one quick thing to both comments? So I always try to, so I'm originally from the suburbs, you know, from a family that quite honestly, nobody in my family would ever be sitting in a room like this, which, like, again, I'm so happy to be here with all of you, but, you know, I mean this as a compliment. Everyone sitting in this room is a very unique person. Like when you get out into, you know, beyond Seattle or beyond our kind of progressive community, not a lot of people would come and sit in a room to learn about EVs for a couple hours on a Sunday. And that's fantastic. But the people that I want to convince, the people that I want to bring around are the everyday regular people like my parents. And just a quick anecdote, because like I said, storytelling is important. My dad, no matter what I did to try to get him when he was getting a new car about 6 years ago, was completely resistant to the idea of even getting a hybrid. Then he started to learn about Tesla and Elon. He didn't get a Tesla. He doesn't have quite that much money, but he started to learn about Tesla and Elon Musk, and got to ride in one of the Teslas with the supercharge button, I think it's called, the boost button, the wow button. What does Elon call it? Something like that. He got to ride in one of those. Ridiculous mode, and it changed his it changed his whole perspective, and now, you know, they ended up leasing a hybrid electric plug-in Honda Accord, and every time I talk to him on the phone, the first thing he tells me about is that he got a little bit better gas mileage the last time he drove it. He's not an environmentalist. He doesn't care about birds, polar bears, or you know, anything like that, but he's converted. And his next car is going to be a fully electric car, and that's, to me, that's really exciting to see that kind of change outside of my frankly, my typical progressive environmental bubble, to see that change happening is really incredible.
Yeah, I just want to say though, I'm not sure that gas cars have a problem. Like if there's broad dissatisfaction with their performance, and I think that sort of chasing, and I agree with what you say, but I'm not sure if there's a real problem that needs to be solved there with gas. And so, anyway.
All right. In my years of experience as a climate activist, I have found mostly that the folks who share that interest and come together in the organizations I've been in are urban and white and privileged mostly. And I guess I want to start concentrating on some populations that are not drawn to this, and that leads me to this question that I got. A column in the Seattle Times regarding why people voted against 1631 east of the mountains was the need for cheap gas to drive long distances. How do we deal with this? Or what specifically, what EV strategy, what EV program might help us deal with this? And I don't know if there's someone here who has an answer to that or thought about it. I suppose it's the range anxiety, but it also might be a financing question.
I mean, I think this is the reason that we need to talk about EVs is more than just pollution-free vehicles, right? We need to and then support the surrounding ecosystem to address that. So building, making investments in charging infrastructure. I talked about the EV infrastructure bank as one of the kind of pieces we need to do. One of the bills that I didn't talk about is an authority bill for our public utilities, which serve about half of Washington's electricity load, to be able to make, using ratepayer dollars, to be able to make additional investments in EV infrastructure. Low carbon fuel standard, the Clean Fuels Program, which it's not a pricing mechanism, it's a mandate to transition off of fossil fuels, but it drives investment in charging infrastructure and availability of these things. So there's basically all the transportation, almost all the transportation policies I talked about were keyed at addressing the financial and range anxiety issues that the public has when they make the choice. Across the mountains, there's some charging available here. It's even here, it's not that much. It's even sparser when you get kind of out of the Puget Sound area. And so those kind of, that's the role of the public sector, of the state, in part, is to kind of fix this kind of core market failure that right now exists, which is that, God bless ChargePoint or whatever, but they're not going to go to a place where they can't sell kilowatt hours to EVs. Like they don't want to put it in a charger in Ellensburg because, or maybe there's one in Ellensburg, I don't know. But the point is those aren't the places where they're going to make a bunch of money. So they put it in the places where demand exists. That's fine. It's not a criticism of the company, but it is a failure. It is an obstacle to adoption, and we need to be able to have the state drive some of those and bridge and kind of, get us up the deployment curve. And so those policies are really important. But I guess the other point to, this kind of comes back to the thing that I think Adam and I were both talking about, is that I didn't want to vote for 1631 because I need cheap gas to drive a long way. It costs a third the price to drive in an electric car that it does in a gasoline car, right? So it doesn't make sense as an argument. It makes sense because that's the experience that people have, but that's why the story about electrification and clean transportation has to be about much more than, what's coming out of their tailpipe or whether they have a tailpipe. It's, you will save money, your life will be improved. All of those things, and telling the story about that is important. I would also say, I'm rambling, but the other piece that kind of in the broad narrative piece is that, the only reason that person thinks that way is because the oil industry and the systems around us have conspired to make sure we do not have another choice. And so it's important to say, yeah, right now you need gasoline you feel that you need gasoline to travel that distance, but that's because the big systems around you have conspired to make sure you didn't have an option to spend 1/3 the price to go that same distance. And so we need both those stories and the policy to support that, the gap that we have.
So we had for climate activists tough news with the 1631, but on the other hand, we have a changed legislature, expanded majorities of Democrats in both houses. And I guess I would like to ask any and all of the panelists what their thoughts are as they contemplate going down to this new legislature.
Yeah, I mean, Tuesday night through Thursday were hard. Kind of knowing the results and waiting, that was difficult, but there were a lot of really big wins. I mean, and there's still some more that could come down the pike. I'm sure I know Vlad and I know, and maybe others in the room know of people who are up in Bellingham right now or who are on their way up to Whatcom County in general, helping to chase down ballots to possibly defeat one of the biggest climate and clean energy enemies the Senate maybe has ever known. I think it's safe to say. The Senate has gotten a lot more friendly to these policies. The House already was and has gotten even more friendly. I think as tough as it was to lose on 1631, I think it definitely creates a sense of urgency for the legislators, at least those who understand the science and understand that we need to be doing a whole lot more, that this is not enough to do something. And, we've built a powerful, energetic movement through 1631. And as I said before, if we can carry that energy into the legislative session, I'm really excited about the 100% clean energy policy for a variety of reasons. But I think, whether or not there's going to be another carbon fee or carbon tax, carbon pricing, cap and trade, whatever you want to call it, in the next legislative session, I think legislators will view this, especially if we do our job right, grassroots side, view this as a great opportunity to pass substantial clean energy legislation, and as a kind of refuge from what has gone down at the ballot box a couple times in a row. So I think we have a great opportunity to pass several pieces of clean energy legislation because of the changed nature of the legislature and of the kind of sense of urgency that losing on a climate policy like the 1631 creates.
I agree with all that. I would just say that it's important to keep in mind that a Democratic majority is not a climate majority, and it basically never has been. And so it got better. Maybe it'll get better if Erickson's totally out. I mean, that would be a wonderful change of pace. So there's absolutely improvements, and there's margins that we can play with and things like that. Some of the elected officials who are working on the 100% clean energy bill though are Republicans, and that's great. But all of this is to say that we shouldn't assume that the better legislature is enough to get the job done. And so this is kind of on the question earlier about IRP or legislature and things like that. This is why it's important. It's not that these expanded Democratic majorities mean that it is now easy. Maybe it's a little bit easier. Maybe it's not. It's certainly not easy to pass these bills. And so continued vigilance and commitment and effort and activity from you all is really important.
Seems like more education is really important.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I think we might, I don't know how we're doing on time, but we might have, we're done. Oh, we're done. But I have more questions. Okay, hands from the audience if anyone has one. Okay. Yeah, what was the question there? Someone had a question, yeah.
Well, I'm just saying, you don't get substance. Part of the reason we're even here is the people who are out of the doorbell for candidates. That was never aligned in any of your stuff about getting involved in candidates and doorbelling and money.
Right.
And I heard the word that you come out on a Sunday. I have not been off a Sunday or Saturday for the last 6 months. And so we have jobs too, and we do things. But I think doorbelling for people and campaigning for it, you want to be able to get to know your legislature and get into their office, doorbell 100 houses.
Well, I want to thank you for your service on that.
Put that in the question. You
Yeah.
didn't read it.
Yeah. Okay. It's 4 o'clock. Okay. Well, I think that's it. Is there some follow on, or do you want to here? Why don't I hand this over? Yeah, I definitely want to thank everyone for coming up and all the ideas. And thank the audience for coming and everyone online.